It's wild to think about, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
we walk around every day and see all the plants and animals and everything, but there's this whole other world
Uh-huh.
that's happening on a scale we can't even see.
Right.
Like, if you zoomed in a million times,
Hmm.
you'd see this whole microverse with amoebas and pronicates and bacteria,
Yeah.
archaea, fungi, all these things battling it out.
All locked in this constant struggle for survival, and then you got
A
these
constant war zone down there.
and then you got these viruses ruling over it all, right? Like there are so many viruses
Oh, yeah.
on Earth, 10 to the power of 23 we're talking about,
That's a ridiculous number.
that if you line them up, they would stretch across 100 million light years.
100 million light years. So these things they're everywhere. They're outnumbering everything else.
They're everywhere.
But the craziest thing is, we're not just talking about like your average everyday virus, you know? Scientists have recently discovered these giant viruses. They call them gyruses.
Right. And it's these gyruses that are really making us rethink what we even consider life to be. Think about your average virus. It's just this tiny little package of genetic material, and it can't even replicate on its own.
Right.
It needs to hijack a cell to make copies of itself.
So it's like a hostile takeover, but on a microscopic level.
Exactly.
Ah.
But what makes gyruses so fascinating is their size. I mean, some of them look like these hairy geometric shapes, while others look like,
And hairy.
well, yeah, they have these filaments and protein coats that give them that appearance.
Oh, interesting.
And some of them look like little mini pickles. I mean, they're so large that at first scientists actually mistook them for bacteria under the microscope.
I can imagine that, like, you're expecting to see a duck, and then boom, it's the size of an elephant.
It's a pretty good analogy.
Yeah.
It really shook things up when they were first discovered.
So, okay, besides their size,
Yeah.
what else makes these gyruses so different from regular viruses?
Well, for one, the number of genes they carry. I mean, your average human cell has around 20,000 genes, right? A bacteria might have a few thousand. Even the coronavirus that caused so much trouble had only about 15.
Right.
But gyruses, they can have hundreds, even thousands of genes.
Thousands. That's crazy. That's more than some bacteria.
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't that make you wonder if maybe these things are more than just these, like, inert packages of genetic material, Are we sure they're not actually alive?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, the line between living and non-living gets really blurry when you start talking about gyruses.
It really does.
Because many of their genes are a complete mystery to us. But what's really interesting is that some of those genes are typically associated with, living organisms.
Like what?
Well, genes involved in metabolism, energy production, even processes that help keep cells alive.
So it's not just that they're big and have a lot of genes, but they also have the kinds of genes we normally associate with life as we know it. That's crazy. Does that mean that some gyruses could actually function on their own, like they don't need a host cell at all?
That's a possibility that some scientists are exploring.
Wow.
And in true, it would completely change how we think about viruses.
It would be a paradigm shift for sure.
But even if they aren't fully independent, these gyruses could be playing a much bigger role than we initially thought.
A bigger role? Like, what do you mean?
Well, imagine these gyruses with all their genes interacting with the cells they infect. They could be swapping genes, creating these kind of hybrid organisms with mixed up DNA.
Oh, wow. So it's not just a hostile takeover then. It's like a genetic exchange program going on.
Exactly.
What kind of impact could that have? I mean, if that's been happening for millions, even billions of years.
Well, think about it this way. What if this constant exchange of genetic material has been going on for billions of years? Could these gyruses have actually been shaping the evolution of their hosts all along?
It's like they're not just these passive hijackers. They're active players in the whole grand evolutionary story.
Right, and maybe they're not just these simple hijackers, but they're actually contributing to the diversity of life as we know it.
That's mind-blowing. We always think of viruses as these purely destructive forces, but what if they're actually helping to create life in ways we haven't even begun to understand?
Yeah.
But it gets even weirder, right? Because now we have viruses hunting viruses.
Yeah, we do. It's pretty wild. This is where things get really interesting. You've got these virophages, these tiny viruses that specifically target gyruses.
So like a whole other level of complexity then. It's like viruses inside cells.
Exactly. Imagine a microscopic world where viruses aren't just infecting cells, but they're battling each other for supremacy.
It's like a never-ending microscopic war.
It is.
Can you give me an example of one of these virophage attacks?
Yeah, so there's this virophage called Sputnik, and it can't replicate on its own. Instead, it hitches a ride on a gyrus called mama virus, which itself is infecting an amoeba.
So Sputnik needs mama virus to get into the amoeba cell first, and then it turns on its host.
Yeah, it's like some kind of microscopic double cross.
That's wild. So how does it work?
Well, Sputnik basically hijacks mama virus's replication machinery. Instead of producing more mama virus, the infected cell starts churning out copies of Sputnik.
So it's like the ultimate betrayal. Mama virus brings Trutnik in, thinking it's got a free ride, and then Sputnik takes over the whole operation.
It's a remarkable example of a virus turning the tables on another virus.
Wow, talk about a plot twist. But surely these gyruses have some way of defending themselves against these virophages, right? They can't just be sitting ducks.
Oh, they do. Some of them have developed these really sophisticated defense systems. They're actually similar to the CRISPR system in bacteria, which acts like a kind of cellular immune system.
So they're like tiny microscopic warriors with their own shields and weapons.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really crazy. Some protists, the single-celled organisms that gyruses often infect, have actually integrated virophage DNA into their own genome.
Wait, so they're using the virophage's own DNA against it. That's like some next-level genetic warfare.
It is, and it's incredibly effective. Basically, these protists become virophage factories. When they get infected by a gyrus, instead of producing more gyruses, they release this flood of virophages to fight back.
That's amazing. So we've got these gyruses, some of which might actually be beneficial, and then we've got these virophages hunting them down. It's like a constant arms race going on in the microverse.
It is a constant arms race with gyruses, virophages, and their hosts all evolving and adapting to try to survive.
It makes you wonder what else is going on down there in that unseen world. It's like a whole other universe just waiting to be explored.
Absolutely, and that's what's so exciting about this field of research. It's still relatively new, which means there's so much more to discover.
Well, I'm definitely hooked. We've covered a lot of ground here, but I feel so many questions.
Well, let's dive into some of those questions. What are you most curious about?
Well, for starters, I'm fascinated by this idea that gyruses might not all be villains. Are there any examples of them actually being beneficial to their hosts? And if so, how does that work?
That's a great question, and one we'll explore further in our deep dive.
So we talked about gyruses being these giant viruses.
Right.
And having all this crazy genetic complexity.
Right.
But I'm still kind of stuck on this idea that they could actually be beneficial to their host.
Oh, yeah.
It just seems so counterintuitive.
Mm.
You know, we usually think of viruses as being harmful, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that most of the viruses we hear about are the ones that cause disease, but the world of viruses is so diverse.
Right.
It's becoming increasingly clear that not all viruses are the bad guys.
So how could a virus, especially a giant one, possibly be good for its host?
Well, let's go back to that idea of genetic exchange we were talking about earlier. Remember, gyruses can carry hundreds or even thousands of genes.
Right.
And a lot of those genes are still a mystery to us.
Yeah, and some of them are even associated with functions we normally see in living organisms, like metabolism and energy production.
Exactly. And what if some of those genes, when they get transferred to the host, actually confer a benefit?
So instead of just hijacking the cell's machinery, the virus is actually contributing something useful.
Yeah, it's like a natural genetic engineering experiment where the virus is introducing new genetic material that could help the host adapt to its environment.
So what kind of benefits are we talking about here?
Well, it really depends on the specific virus and the host involved, but there's evidence that some gyruses might help their host become more resistant to other infections or even improve their ability to survive in harsh environments.
That's wild. So in a way, these gyruses could be acting as partners in evolution, helping their hosts adapt and thrive.
That's one way to look at it, and it really challenges our traditional view of viruses as purely parasitic entities.
It really does.
But of course, not all gyruses are going to be beneficial, and there's still a lot we don't know about their interactions with their hosts.
Right. It makes me wonder if there's kind of a spectrum, with some viruses being purely harmful, others being purely beneficial, and then a whole range in between.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful way to think about it. It highlights just how complex and nuanced the relationship between viruses and their hosts can be.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears for a moment and talk more about those virophages, the viruses that hunt other viruses.
Right.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea that something so small and seemingly simple could have such a complex strategy.
I know they're pretty amazing. Tiny but mighty. They're incredibly effective at what they do. Remember how Sputnik targets mama virus?
Yeah, it basically hijacks mama virus's replication machinery and turns the infected cell into a Sputnik factory.
Precisely. But Sputnik isn't the only virophage out there. Scientists are discovering new ones all the time, and each one seems to have its own unique way of targeting and disabling its prey.
So it's not just a one-size-fits-all approach.
Nope, not at all.
What other strategies are there?
Well, some virophages can integrate their genetic material into the genome of the newly produced gyruses.
So they're basically infecting the viruses that are infecting the cells.
Exactly. They turn them into these sleeper agents.
Sleeper agents. That sounds sneaky.
It is. So the infected gyrus might go on to infect another cell, but instead of producing more gyruses, it unleashes a wave of virophages, sabotages its own replication.
Wow, so it's like a Trojan horse attack, but on a microscopic scale.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see why you called it an arms race in the microverse.
Yeah.
It's this constant back and forth with each player evolving new weapons and defenses.
It is. It's a constant battle for survival down there.
And all of this is happening right now all around us on a scale we can't even see. It's mind-boggling. But I have to ask, why should we care? What does any of this have to do with us?
That's a great question, and one that scientists are actively exploring. Understanding gyruses and virophages could have some really big implications for human health biotechnology, even our understanding of life itself.
Really? Like how?
Well, for example, imagine harnessing the power of virophages to develop new antiviral therapies.
So you're talking about using viruses that hunt viruses to fight the viruses that make us sick.
Exactly. You see, traditional antibiotics often have a broad spectrum of activity, meaning they can kill both harmful and beneficial bacteria, which can lead to side effects and contribute to the rise of antibiotic resistance.
Right.
But virophages are much more targeted in their approach.
So instead of wiping out a whole population of bacteria, good and bad, we could use virophages to specifically target the harmful viruses.
Exactly. And that could lead to new treatments for viral infections that are more effective and have fewer side effects.
That's incredible. Are there any other potential applications? What about those mystery genes that gyruses carry? Could those be useful?
Absolutely. That's another area with huge potential. Those unknown genes could encode for proteins with novel functions potentially useful in medicine, biotechnology, or even agriculture.
So we're not just talking about fighting viruses, but potentially harnessing their power for good.
Exactly. It just goes to show that even the smallest, most seemingly insignificant organisms can have a profound impact on our lives.
I'm definitely starting to see that. But before we get too carried away with all the potential applications, let's take a step back and consider the bigger picture. All this research into gyruses and virophages is really challenging our understanding of what it means to be alive, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the traditional definition of life is based on a set of criteria, right? Like metabolism, reproduction, and the ability to respond to stimuli.
Right.
But gyruses, with their complex genes and potential for independent function, they really blur the lines between what we consider living and non-living.
It's like we're expanding the map of life, discovering new territories, and pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible.
Exactly. And that's one of the most exciting things about science. It's constantly challenging our assumptions and forcing us to rethink what we thought we knew.
Okay, one final question before we wrap things up. If these gyruses can be so diverse and adaptable, and we're only just beginning to scratch the surface of their world, what other surprises might be lurking out there in the microverse?
Oh, that's a great question. And honestly, I have no idea. But that's what makes this field so exciting. There's so much we don't know. So much left to discover. Who knows what other elephant-sized ducks might be hiding out there, just waiting to be found.
Well, I, for one, can't wait to find out. You know, it's funny, right? We spend all this time looking out into space, trying to find life on other planets.
Yeah.
But right here on Earth, we've got this whole hidden universe in the microscopic world
Right under our noses.
that we're just starting to understand.
It really makes you realize just how much we still don't know about our own planet.
It's incredible. And to think we almost missed these giant viruses completely.
Oh, yeah.
If scientists hadn't accidentally mistaken them for bacteria. Who knows how long it would have taken us to discover them.
It makes you wonder what other surprises are still out there just waiting to be found.
Exactly like what other elephant-sized ducks are hiding in the microscopic world.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so last question, and I know this might sound a little philosophical, but if these gyruses can be so complex and, potentially even blur the lines between living and non-living, what does that tell us about life itself? Like, do we need to rethink our definition of what it means to be alive?
Well, that's a big question, and it's one that people have been debating for a long time, even before we discovered giant viruses.
Yeah.
But viruses definitely add a whole new layer of complexity to the discussion.
They do.
I mean, if they can have genes for things like metabolism and energy production, if they can potentially even function independently, where do they fit in?
Right. It's not as simple as just saying, okay, viruses are non-living and bacteria are living.
Exactly.
Maybe it's more of a gradient with different organisms, exhibiting different degrees of aliveness.
I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. It shows us just how limited our current definitions can be.
Yeah.
We like to put things in these neat categories,
Right.
but nature doesn't always follow the rules.
It seems like we're constantly expanding our understanding of the universe, both on the huge scale and the tiny scale.
That's the beauty of science.
And every new discovery forces us to rethink what we thought we knew.
It keeps us on our toes, for sure.
So that makes me wonder what other mind-blowing discoveries are still out there waiting for us in the microscopic world.
Who knows? That's what's so exciting about it.
I can't wait to find out. This deep dive has been incredible. I feel like I've learned so much, and it's given me a whole new appreciation for the complexity and the wonder of the microverse.
That's great to hear.
And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep an open mind, because you never know what amazing discoveries are waiting for you, even in the smallest, most unexpected places.